you so much, and thank you for being here. I wanted to review some of the research that I have been undertaking for the last about 2 years. And I want to start out by saying that this is a bit of a mystery that I'm trying to solve. The mystery is a transcription of a letter that apparently no longer exists. What we have is only either transcript or a photocopy of the original. And because of that, I've held off publication because I've been trying to get the archives at Harvard to locate that letter. And only recently, last May, I received word that they never had a record of this letter. They knew nothing about it. And yet there's evidence that it existed, that it was in the library. I don't want to make any pronouncement about what happened to it. You could draw your own conclusion, but letters get misplaced, unfortunately. And this is an important letter. It's not simply opinions about people. It has to do with serious content that relates to the secret doctrine, to the stanzas of John, especially stanza number 4. And we're dealing with also a very difficult topic, at least for me, maybe not for you, called Gematria. And it is a discussion that also appears in the secret doctrine and is mentioned. Now, there would have been no way that I discovered this letter had it not been for the help of Daniel Caldwell. And so I'd like to give him credit for this. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background. Those of you who know Daniel realize that he is the founder and the organizer of the Blavatsky archives. So a little bit of history. Back in around 2017, I published in Theosophical History, in volume 18, number 1 and 2, a letter that has been discussed, that has been partially quoted, but has never been given anywhere, included anywhere in detail. That was the letter of H.B. Blavatsky to James Ralston Skinner. It was a 36-page letter, probably the longest letter that Blavatsky has ever written. It was very important. Those of you who've read Sylvia Cranston's Extraordinary Life of Blavatsky realize that she did, if you paid attention, she did quote from that letter, and she cites it. But beyond that, there was another letter that she cited, but she simply said it belonged to the archives of the Andover-Harvard Theological Library. It's actually the library or the archives. But she doesn't give a date, and she doesn't cite anything about this letter. So the only way that anybody could locate this passage that appears in Sylvia Cranston would be to maybe do a detailed search of the collections, of which, by the way, there are 2 Blavatsky collections at Harvard. One is the collection called the Blavatsky Collection, which is number 516 in their collection. And that is a collection of 16 letters of H.P. Blavatsky to William Q. Judge, in addition to 2 additional letters, one by Keatley. Those letters, probably you know, exist in 2 collections. One in Theosophical History in a series of transcriptions in 1995-96, and the transcriptions were done by Michael Gomes. And as I understand it, there's another collection, I believe that Dara Eklund and Nicholas Weeks also undertook, and that's on Daniel's website, the Blavatsky Archive. So you can get those letters. They are accessible. The second collection was not known until I would say 1980 or 81. And that was the so-called Skinner collection. That collection contained a number of letters to Skinner, 3 of which are original Blavatsky letters. That's what we have right now, including the February 17th letter, but there are also 2 other letters dated March and April. And then there are 2 copies of these letters. However, there was a statement by Sylvia Cranston. I know her as Anita Atkins, and that's the way she identified herself in the correspondence. She identified 4 letters. Well, what happened to the 4th letter? That was the problem. So the point is that there is some evidence to suggest that the letter was in the collection. We have an eyewitness account, Anita Atkins. We have a written account in her publication, The Extraordinary Life, and I'll read that to you. But we also have, unknown, I think, up until now, a quotation by Skinner himself in a series of articles that he wrote called The Kabbalah. And that article was actually in 9 parts. It was in part 8, and I believe there may have been a mention in part 9 of the Kabbalah, in which he actually quotes Madame Blavatsky's letter of December 25th, 1886. So we have that for sure. Also, there's another record, and if I have the time at the very end of the presentation, I wanted to give myself about a half an hour or so. I wanted to show you some of the documents. There is an article by Dos McDavid. I'm not sure if any of you know him. He's from Texas. I believe he's a chiropractor, and he's also interested in gematria. And so the story goes, what he told me was that he was doing research and he wrote to Daniel, and Daniel gave him the letter, and Dos did not quote from the letter, but he explained a little bit of the contents. And he does cite December 25th, 1886. So we have the physical evidence that this letter actually existed. Then after a very long correspondence with Daniel, he decided to send me the letter. First, he sent me a transcript, and a transcript actually existed. And here is the background to that. The letters to the Andover-Harvard Library were donated by a Charles Wiggins III. And who this person was, we knew nothing about, but it turns out that he may have been a descendant of Skinner, but the name Wiggins is through the wife's name. James Skinner married a Laura Wiggins, and so it could be that Charles Wiggins was descended, if not directly from Skinner, perhaps from one of the relatives of the Wiggins family. So somehow he got a hold of the Blavatsky letters. In 1978, there was located in the Harvard Library a donation letter dated March the 28th, 1978, in which it is stated that Mr. Wiggins donated the letters. And so that's how it got into the library. Nobody knew about this donation. Sylvia Cranston spoke about the fact that the Skinner letters were lost. Nobody knew where they were. And then all of a sudden they were discovered. But who discovered them? It was a person who came to Harvard as a research student. He came to study with the, I think it's called the Institute for World Religions, which is adjacent to Harvard University. And as an aside, I should mention here that this institute was founded by the Theosophical Society by a lady who wanted to have an academic institution involved in the study of Theosophy as well as other world religions. It was really world religions that she was interested in. But the interesting thing about this was that the Theosophical Society was not the Adyar Society. It was not the ULT. It was not the Pasadena Theosophical Society. It was a society that is now defunct. That was the Hargrove Society. And this is a rather mysterious society, but it has made an impact. This is one of the impacts. And as an aside again, it turns out that the lady who contributed, this was the Genevieve Griscom Trust, as the official entity that gave these, donated to this institute. It turns out that she became a leader of sorts of a religion of the living, called something like the Church of the Living Christ. And now I'm totally puzzled, as well as my colleague Sean Higgins, as to what the relationship could be between the Theosophical Society of New York, that's the original society, and this rather cult-like institution. And again, as an aside, it's interesting that their headquarters was a mansion in the Bronx, not too far from where I lived. In fact, I never knew this existed. And all of them are now buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, which is not too far from that particular mansion. But there was a nice write-up about this about, I'd say, something like 30 or 40 years ago, about this lady, Miss Griscom, who was related, by the way, to the Griscom family, very prominent members of the Theosophical Society. So that is a little bit of a background of what is going on here. Now, the letters themselves in the Skinner collection numbered well over 100. It's not just Blavatsky's letters, but it's interesting. There were letters from a James Parker, who was the author of the quadrature, the squaring of the circle. There were letters by the archaeologist Seifert. These are very prominent individuals at the time. There was even a letter from a Harvard professor who I was well aware of, William Dwight Whitney, the professor of Sanskrit at Harvard, who in fact wrote the book on Sanskrit grammar that we used when I was a student. So here I finally found a letter of his in one of the collections. So that's what we were faced with. But the question was, what happened to this letter? So getting back to the letter itself, it was donated, we presume, around 1978. It was then discovered around 1979, 1980 by this research student by the name of Ananda Vikrama Ratna, who was in fact assigned there for about 2 years. He was there about till 1981, so that we know that the transcription that he performed on this letter took place around 1980-81. And then, after that, he went to Wheaton. And while at Wheaton, Anita Atkins visited, and he told Anita Atkins of this letter. And not only this letter, but also the February letter, the March letter, the April letter, all of the Blavatsky letters in the Skinner collection, which excited Anita very much. So what happened was that she arranged to have his transcriptions, which were handwritten, and the letters themselves were transcribed by Vikramaratna, with the exception of the February letter. That was done by someone else, a lady by the name of Miss Howe. And then Anita volunteered to type them up. And so I'm going to show you the typescript copy of the letter and the photocopy of the original letter. Not an easy task. If you're wondering why it's taken me 3 years, 2 years, 3 years to do this, you'll understand when you see it. So that occurred. And then, it would, of course, the letters themselves were in terrible shape. If any of you ever seen the judge letters or the Skinner letter, you'll realize that what you're seeing now is a restored copy of these letters. They were restored because Anita Atkins paid for it, and she urged the university to put them, to preserve them before they completely disappeared. And that occurred around 1983. There was an article that appeared in the Harvard Library Review that actually shows a picture of the unrestored letter, and I believe it's the February 17th letter that was shown, and the restored. And it's a world of difference. You'll understand, if you can read the letters today, it's because of the restoration. If you look at the original, I don't think it would be all that easy. So that takes us now to 1983-84. After that, the letters were in the library, and then the next mention of them was in the biography of Blavatsky by Sylvia Cranston. And if you read the biography very carefully, there are a number of places where she mentions the Ralston letters. In the preface, for instance, I believe around page 317 or thereabouts, she talks about them. She quotes from the 17th of February letter. She also quotes, which I will, I'll quote you from this passage. And again, if you were a type of scholar who wanted to trace this to the letters, you would not be able to find it. But let me read you. I have read and reread your Hebrew-Egyptian mystery 20 times over and recommend it to all our Kabbalists, such as Reverend A.W. Ayton and Mathers, a very good Kabbalist. Only one who loses too much his head with ceremonial magic, which I detest. Certain geometrical diagrams and figures especially have a power in them of reacting on the awakening of activities of the half-blind and brainless creatures of the elements, which power and creatures you may deny. We of the esoteric Vedanta philosophy of Hinduism know the power certain circles and diagrams have on the elements. This is why I believe in but hate and dread ceremonial magic. Beware of certain figures and combinations thereof, Mr. Skinner. So that's the quotation. It's not a continuous quotation. Atkins, as she often does, will pick and choose over as many as 3 pages and then just pull out what she wants to quote. Now, out of this, we can take some lessons from it, but I do want to emphasize that this is solid proof that the letter existed as far as 1994 or so. The book was published around that time. And the question arose, well, what about the original? What happened to it? And as I say, no record of it. So my guess, if I had to say, is that Atkins got a hold of the letter in the early 80s. The typed transcription around 83, and that is what she used. So eventually she got the handwritten copy. I think this was after the cataloging. This could have been as late as 1990, and after that it just disappears. The photocopy then may be a copy that was made around 1990 or so, when the library actually made it available to scholars. So why is this letter so important? I wanted to just summarize. As I mentioned again, this is crucial for our understanding of stanza 4. And also the numbers that are used, the 1, 3, 5, 1, 6, that you often find in Blavatsky. It also helps to explain Kabbalah. Skinner, according to Blavatsky, considered the Kabbalah as merely mathematical and geometrical. Now let's take one more step. It was not mysterious. It was not, the term that she used, I believe, was, occult would have been the term used. It was strictly mathematical. Now, there's one insight that one can make from this observation. Go back to the beginnings of the Theosophical Society. What instigated the society, what instigated Olcott to suggest a society, was a lecture that was given by one George Henry Felt. And I often wondered, 20 years ago when I wrote the article on Felt, I was puzzled what it was that excited Olcott so much and what it was that excited Blavatsky. Was it the materialization of elementals, or was it the diagrams that Felt displayed? And in a way, it was both. Because what we'll find in the letter is that because of the magical quality or the occult qualities of certain diagrams, these diagrams can actually materialize these entities, these elementals. So it was both. It was a combination of the two. So I think an explanation saying that the members of the audience were excited because of the elementals tells only half the story. It's what caused this materialization, and it was through Kabbalah. And by the way, the title of Felt's lecture was, at least from one source, Kabbalah. Now another point that's very interesting, and now we're getting into James Skinner, James Ralston Skinner. By the way, for one person in the audience, he was called J. Ralston Skinner because he was a lawyer. So you'll understand what I'm saying. Now, Ralston Skinner was rather obscure. I'm sure if any of you heard of him, it may have been through the works of John Drace and his analysis of the Hebrew from the source of measures. But the famous book that he produced was simply called The Source of Measures. And it was to explain the British inch. Anybody who looks at this book would say, well, what does this have to do with Kabbalah? But there is a connection, and again, it's through geometrical design. So Ralston was a Mason, and it turns out, from what I gather, that many Masons were interested in the Kabbalah. Felt was a Mason. Skinner was a Mason. Skinner was a Mason, by the way, in Cincinnati. So again, as an aside, those of you who are interested, there's a connection between the Cincinnati, Ohio theosophists, such as Gerard Buck, who was a very well-known theosophist, and of course poets, Platonists such as Johnson, and K. Paul Johnson, by the way, had a little talk and mention of Johnson. And by the way, those who are interested in Paul Johnson's work on the Letters to the Sage, Volume 1, there are mentions of Skinner in that volume. So this is the first time that Skinner has been mentioned for over 100 years. His name was practically forgotten. He was the type of person who did not want to be known outside of his own very limited circle. Had he been, we might say, someone who advertised himself, he would have been very well known, because look at what Felt was doing. Henry Felt never produced a book. He only produced a prospectus, and he got quite a bit of publicity in all the New York newspapers as early as 1872, and maybe even earlier than that, on his work on the Kabbalah and his great discovery. What Felt was promising to discover, I think Skinner did. And so the real Kabbalist who really actualized this whole idea of Kabbalah was Skinner, not Felt. Felt promised, and then he disappeared, as you know, not too long after the foundation of the society. But Skinner produced the source of measures in 1875. So why was Skinner interested in Blavatsky? Well, he was doing some work. He produced a new manuscript. Some of you may remember that Miss Cannon also showed us, this is the first time I've ever seen it, the manuscript in the Adyar archives of this new edition or continuation of the source of measures. It's over 300 pages long. It was supposed to have been given to Blavatsky around 1886. It was completed in 1884, and Skinner heard about Blavatsky through Buck, and Buck praised him. If you go to the pages of the Theosophists, you realize that Buck had a high regard for Skinner, and he urged Skinner to write to Blavatsky. So Skinner must have written around November or so in 1886. And the letter that I have is the response to all the questions that Skinner had. So that's where the origin comes from. That manuscript in the Adyar Library is very valuable, and it was in fact inspected by C.J. Rajadasa around 1923, and he actually gives a rather detailed account of the contents of that manuscript. So I think, I heard that it was to be published. I asked Ms. Cannon again, and she said that I believe it's going to be digitalized. So it's really crucial that that digitalized equipment be given to the archives. They have some valuable material there. So that was the urging of the of Skinner to Blavatsky to respond to certain questions. And so what Blavatsky did was to write something like what was it? I think about 14 pages in length, which was quite long for the first paper. I can't go over the entire paper with you, but I can only tell you that she mentions Subaru, for instance. She'll mention George Henry Felt, and she even mentions that she studied mathematics under Felt, but couldn't understand what he was talking about. And there were other little quips along the way, but these are just little odds and ends. What's really important is the context. The last half of the paper gets into stanza 4 and goes into this deep analysis of the numerology and the importance of letters. So how are we doing? Okay. What I wanted to do, again, I didn't want to go into details on this, but just to give you an idea of the sense of what is going on, and just perhaps to cut here, and if you bear with me, I'm going to try to show you some of the documents so you understand what I'm talking about. You have here a letter to Dora Kunz. And for those, I think you know that Dora van Gelder Kunz was the president or general secretary of the American section. And this is an original letter. I believe along the way, I want to give credit. I don't know, did you send it, or?
I think maybe I sent it to you.
Yeah. I know Daniel sent it, and I want to give them credit. I don't know if you can read this, but I'll read part of it, and this helps to establish what has happened. She says, when I was at Wheaton, Vikramaratna told me about these letters, which he had discovered in the archives of Andover-Harvard Theosophical, I'm sorry, she reads Theosophical, I do the same thing, Theological it should be, library. He transcribed most of them, but had never typed them up. I volunteered to do this, a horrendous job it turned out to be, in reading Ananda's handwriting. I also went to Harvard to transcribe one long letter dated February 17th, 1887. So again, she did not actually transcribe from the original, but she actually typed out, I think, the transcription of the original. And she mentions here Mrs. Alois Hume, whom you well know, and she is the person who transcribed that letter. By the way, as I say again, the 17th of February letter is in Theosophical History 2016. Okay. So that was the letter by Anita. While I was at the archives, I found some other correspondence as well, and it helps to bear out a number of items. I can't show them all to you. But it bears out, first of all, that Anita was responsible for the restoration of the letters, the cooperation of the library. The archives were, in fact, very well suited for these letters because they make them accessible. For all of you who realize, if you work in archives, sometimes in universities, they'll have you sign agreements, non-disclosure, any number of things. Harvard, when I asked, they said, well, you could do whatever you want with these letters. You could publish them. You don't need our permission. Just go ahead and do it. And so that is one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue this. This is the current state of transcription that I'm doing. And what I had to do was to go to the photocopy. I could not simply copy from the transcript of Anita Atkins because there were too many mistakes, too many missing elements. And also, the letter itself was in such poor condition that both Vikramaratna and Anita Atkins could not understand some portions of it. You would need to take many, many months going over it, and you can't do it just in a short period of time. You have to lay it aside and then look at it with fresh eyes and then try to determine exactly what is being said. But I can point out to you, if you can read part of this, what is important is, first of all, or some of the mentions that I think are important, the mention of Arthur Gebhard and his behavior, not telling Madame Blavatsky about the manuscript, so she never read it at the time. She admits that she's a poor mathematician, and along the way she mentions, as I just did, George Henry Felt, who is was a close associate of Blavatsky around 1875 or so. And he lasted until about 1876 or 7. Okay. Now, what I have in blue is what Anita Atkins quoted. And you'll see that what she did was to take certain excerpts and then skip. So it starts out with, I have read and reread the Hebrew, Egyptian mystery 20 times over, etc. So she considered this book very important. And one item about this that's, I think, should be mentioned, I did at the history conference, I'll do it again, was that the person who was quoted the most in the Secret Doctrine, with the exception of Plato, is James Ralston Skinner. So he plays a very important role in the Secret Doctrine. Sometimes he's identified simply as a noted Kabbalist, sometimes simply a friend. Skinner did not want his name mentioned all the time, so you have to read it very carefully. Something like 67 mentions of Skinner. Blavatsky admits here, I am no mathematician, and rather see or sense the spirit of analogy through the symbolism than by checking the figures on both sides. So, again, Skinner was a type of complement to Blavatsky. What Blavatsky didn't know, Skinner knew. But then Skinner wanted information about the Hindu side, and that's the origin of the correspondence. We go down, and then at the end of the page, it begins with, let's see, I have, okay. This is the end of this first section of the correspondence, of the quotation that Atkins included in her book. And as we go down, she speaks about a number of items that are not included in Atkins. For instance, the emphasis on symbols and analogical allegories. She talks about her secret doctrine and that she's going to include a lot of this material in the secret doctrine. I'm putting this in color code because I have to either explain the terms or correct the terms in the proper spelling. And we go down, and here we have, at the beginning of page 4, the quote continues by Atkins. She picks up around this section, 14, and she talks about geometrical diagrams and figures, and she mentions here that they have a power in them reacting on and awakening to activity those elementals. And so she quotes that and then skips down to know the power certain circles and diagrams have on the elementals. This, to me, is the clearest explanation of what happened with the Felt lecture. And this is what Felt supposedly produced in his original lecture in 1875. But as I mentioned again, what Felt was promising, Skinner already produced. So I think he needs some sort of recognition. And the letter continues. Again, I had to color code this because there is some Sanskrit here that I need to explain. And I want to point out something else that occurred to me as I was reviewing this letter. I don't know if you've heard of this analogy, but I'll give it to you. What Euclid is to Greek philosophy, Panini is to Hindu philosophy. Have you heard of this? Okay, let me explain. This was introduced by Fritz Stahl, who was a Sanskrit professor at Berkeley in California. And he was writing an article on the comparison of Greek philosophy and Hindu philosophy. And noted that apparently, if you look at Greek philosophy in general, it is based on geometry. Whereas Hindu philosophy is based on grammar. If you look at the Shaddharma Samhita, it is a grammatical school, a philosophical school unto itself, the Paniniya school of grammar. If you look at commentaries of Sanskrit philosophy, you will find that the natural urge of the commentator is to give a grammatical analysis of the text. It's not interested in mathematics. It's more interested in the morphology, the phonology, and the syntax of Sanskrit. So, again, Blavatsky picks up on that, and she does it in a slightly different way. What Skinner was involved with was mathematics. What Blavatsky is involved with was, I wouldn't say grammar, but she throws in a little bit of grammar with terms like soham and kalahansa and I think, oh yes, the combination of Brahma and Brahma. The masculine form of Brahma, long A, and Brahma, the neuter form, one being a derivative of the neuter Brahma. So she says this, and she mentions this so many times. This is a little bit of the Hindu influence on Blavatsky, coming from grammar, not so much from, of course, mathematics, which she claims she knew very little about. So this is what gave me that idea. And here is another important quote. This is from stanza 4. And she does give a detailed analysis of this particular stanza, the 1, the 3, the 5, the twice 7. This is repeated many times in the Secret Doctrine. It is explained in the letter. It is quoted in Skinner in his own article on the Kabbalah. Here's another question that might arise. And I'm asking this as an academic, and I'm curious. We all know that the stanzas of Zion are claimed to come from a very old book, according to the beginning of Isis Unveiled, that these stanzas were already there for thousands of years, but yet, where does Skinner get them if that was the case? So is there a historical precedent for these stanzas? So it's a question that kind of parallels what Paul Johnson asked about the masters. Were the masters historical, or were they beyond history? Okay, so that is the letter and transcript, and I want to, if I can find it, try to show you what the original looked like, and let's see if that's it. No. Oh, by the way, this is, while I'm at it, this is the typed transcription of Anita Atkins. That transcription was apparently in the library. Daniel, again, had it, and also, I think John as well. And so this transcript did get around to a small circle. And the small circle include Grace Kanoki of the TS Pasadena. It included John Cooper, who, after his death in 1997, his archive was donated to the National Library, so I think According to John, it should be there. Dara Eklund had a copy. And so it was a very, very limited circle of scholars, theosophical scholars, who knew about this letter. And a little funny story about this is that after the publication of the February 17th letter in 2017, Daniel wrote to me, he says, well, what happened to the first part? I said, well, what first part? He said, you know, the letter that preceded this one. I said, there's no letter that preceded this one. This is the February letter was the very first one. He says, surely you're joking. And I said, no, I don't know anything about it. So he told me that he was a little bit disappointed that I didn't know about the letter, but who knew? You know, you had to know Anita Atkins in order to know of the existence of this letter and whoever she shared this letter with. And I don't fault Daniel. He was very generous in lending it to me, but I was surprised that he thought I should know about this. I'm sorry, I don't. Okay, but this was a transcription, and I looked at this, by the way, very carefully. As I say again, there are many problems with it, but considering where she got this from, it was a very good piece of work. This is the letter. And this is unrestored. You will not see this quality or poor quality in Harvard. You can go online and now access the letters digitally through the Hollis Library archives. And you will find when you see the February letter or the March letter or the April letter that they're in pretty good shape. Well, that's because of the restoration. But this is what they looked like before. And the problem, don't try to read it. Looks better up on the screen here. But it is because of the bleeding from the other side of the page is sometimes very difficult to read, and sometimes Blavatsky's handwriting gets a little bit messy. So this is the letter itself. Sometimes also corners are cut off, and you can see here the difficulty in reading a letter like this. And when I got this letter, the problem was that they were not necessarily in order. So when I was following the letter, I found that all of a sudden there was a break, and I was wondering, well, what happened to this letter? So I had to go through every page to try to determine where that other letter was. It was there. It was not lost. It was just simply misplaced. So I believe page 14 was actually number 4. So that was one of those little discoveries. There are symbols given, which are very important. So again, when she talks about the geometrical situation, she'll try to illustrate them. For those of you who are interested, Skinner was given credit for knowing or accessing the 2 keys of the 7 in understanding this wisdom. And that is, this is a good page here because of her symbolism. She was trying to actually show from the description what that symbol would be. I want to stop here. If there are any questions, I want to leave you some time to raise them. Okay, I'll leave that here for now.